Good morning, welcome, or good evening, for those of us joining from the other side of the Pacific. Welcome to the Georgetown University webinar on COVID-19, the challenges and opportunities for U.S. China relations. I'm Professor Michael Green of the School of Foreign Service, Director of Asian Studies. Some of you also know me for my work at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. We have an all-star panel joining us today to try to put in context the disturbing developments, but also some positive signs in U.S. China relations in the context of the current coronavirus. We hope everyone listening is well and is having a productive time despite the circumstances, and we hope we can contribute to your intellectual enrichment for the time you join us this morning. I'd also like to thank Tom Banshoff, the Vice President of Georgetown for Global Engagement and Head of U.S. China Dialogue and Asian Studies, to welcome our students from Fudan and Beida and Georgetown, especially the newly admitted Masia Masters in Asian Studies students at Georgetown. Welcome aboard. The topic today is a tough one because we're dealing with a political and geopolitical set of challenges in the midst of the most significant health and economic challenge most of us have faced in our lifetimes as a local, national, and global society. In the 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, the United States and China have seen transnational threats strike us several times. The 1997 financial crisis, 9/11, when I was in the White House, the avian influenza and SARS, the 2008 financial crisis. In most of these previous examples, the US and China actually increased cooperation in specific areas, or at a minimum did not worsen relations or intensify rivalry. The current situation is clearly different. COVID-19 is coinciding with, or is being marked by, an intensifying vitriol in the dialogue, official dialogue, but also national discourse between the United States and China. Last week, Harris and the Washington Post published a public opinion poll in the United States showing a marked deterioration of the American public's views of China in the wake of the coronavirus. In China, social media is full of conspiracy theories and speculation there will be a major conflict. One of our panelists, Wang Jishe, had a fascinating piece he wrote recently describing how views of the US have changed in fundamental ways in China. The United States has withdrawn support from the World Health Organization, largely because of US-China issues, has clashed with its allies in the G7 by demanding that this be called the Wuhan virus. But the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman has advanced conspiracy theories that somehow the US Army was responsible for the virus. It is really one of the most vexing and concerning times in US-China relations that I've ever seen in my professional career. And there are others on this panel with more experience, but I suspect my colleagues are similarly concerned. Why is this happening? We'll try to unbundle that today. Could be the nature of political leadership in both countries. Could be the nature of this virus, how it hit us, the defensiveness about its emergence and the handling of the virus in both countries and around the world. Could be structural. Many of the challenges in US-China relations before COVID-19, the South China Sea, Xinjiang trade, are still there, and in some cases, the South China Sea arguably becoming more problematic. Some people have argued there's a power shift underway, and this is just accelerating it. This is an argument that my colleague Evan Medeiros and I rejected pretty soundly in a piece in Foreign Affairs this week. We don't think this marks or accelerates a power shift, but there is a failure of US leadership, and China is facing some backlash in its own soft power campaign. Some in the debate fear there could be real conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan, for example. The new Chinese aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, just crossed through the Miyako Straits in a move that's viewed as threatening in Taiwan. I don't think conflict is likely, but we should consider that as well. And other voices have started to argue that this has gone too far, that we need to find ways to cooperate on this pandemic because it's in our interest to do so in spite of strategic competition in other areas. A group of Chinese scholars signed a letter to that effect. Evan and I signed on to a letter about a week ago, organized by former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, Professor Susan Shur, Kurt Campbell, and others, arguing in the US side that we need to find ways to cooperate with China. The interesting thing about the letter was, if you looked at who signed it, it was a pretty full range of views on U.S.-China relations. There were hawks, there were doves. Some of the toughest critics of China signed on to this and said, look, we can compete, but we've got to find ways to cooperate. There are areas of cooperation. I think we'll discuss those. Business is working well, civil society to some extent, epidemiologists. But this is a truly complex time, and in some ways the perfect storm of geopolitics and pandemics and economic challenges. So we want to try to draw on the experts we have to make sense of this. And we've pulled together an all-star cast, we think. We're still waiting to hear from one of our colleagues who was on and dropped and will be joining shortly. Professor Wu Jinbo, who I think you can see on the screen, is a professor and dean at the Institute of International Studies and director at the Center for American Studies at Fudan University in Shanghai. He teaches and researches China's foreign and security policy, U.S.-China relations, U.S.-Asia policy. He received his PhD from Fudan. He's been a visiting scholar at George Washington University, Stanford, the Stimson Center, U.S. Institute of Peace, Brookings. He's a prolific writer with award-winning books. I've written several book chapters and projects with him, and he's a truly rigorous scholar with policy-relevant views. Professor Eva Medeiros, my colleague at Georgetown, is the Penner Family Chair in Asian Studies in the School of Foreign Service. He's the Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in U.S. China Studies. He previously served for 6 years on the staff of the National Security Council in the White House, first as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and then as Special Assistant to President Obama and Senior Director for Asia. That's the same position I had in the Bush administration, so we're trying to bring you a healthy balance and bipartisan view on U.S.-China relations. Before working in the White House, Evan was at the Treasury Department and the RAND Corporation. He's worked for major consulting firms. His research and teaching focus on international politics in East Asia, U.S.-China relations, China's foreign national security policy. He's teaching a course now, and I think his students are probably all on. Their final exam is coming up in a week or two, so I hope they take good notes. And we'll be joined, I believe, by Professor Wang Jise. Jise was on earlier, and we had an interruption to the feed, and we'll get him back on shortly, I hope. Well known to many of you, one of the most distinguished scholars in China's modern history, Wang Jise is professor in the School of International Studies and president of the International and Strategic Studies Institute at Peking University, Beida. He's honorary president of the Chinese Association for American Studies and was a member of the Foreign Policy Advisory Committee of China's Foreign Ministry. He spent 1968-78 in the countryside as a laborer, and then completed work at Beida and directed the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Science, and later was dean at Beida's School of International Studies. He has a long list of distinguished visiting professorships and fellowships in Washington, ranging from Berkeley to Michigan, in the United States, ranging from Berkeley to Michigan, Claremont, McKenna. He's also been at Oxford, writes prolifically, including a recent piece on U.S.-China relations in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, which I read through Google Chrome Translate, which worked remarkably well. But those of you who can read Chinese can read it in the original. We're going to ask 3 questions of our panelists in sequence to try to make sense of where we are. First, I'll ask each of them what the impact of the COVID-19 crisis has been on U.S.-China relations to date so far. We'll hear from each of the panelists and have some exchange. Second, I want to hear their views on what prospects there are, if any, for improving relations or finding areas of cooperation or minimizing confrontation between now and the end of the year, or between now and the presidential election. And third, what does the COVID-19 crisis tell us about the longer-term trajectory of U.S.-China relations? What might its legacy or impact be going forward? We'll then open it up to questions from all of you watching us online. You can send your questions by email. And the email address is one word, no punctuation or dashes or anything. It's U.S. China Dialogue at Georgetown, Georgetown.edu. So if you want to send a question, you can email it to U.S. China Dialogue at Georgetown.edu. U.S. China Dialogue at Georgetown.edu. And Our staff will be feeding them to me in a Google document, and I'll present the questions to our panelists as we go forward. So we're still waiting for Professor Wang, so I'll start with you, Xinbo. On the first question, if you could reflect on where we are in terms of U.S.-China relations and what has happened in the few quite dramatic months since this broke in Wuhan. What's your assessment?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for inviting me. Good morning or good evening, everyone. I think the coronavirus as a major humanitarian crisis occurred in a very bad time in U.S.-China relations. This crisis and the response from both sides to it really reveals to us some painful truths. It started with some very negative and nasty impact. When the coronavirus first broke out in China, I felt shocked and also frustrated hearing people in the United States, inside and outside the U.S. government, taking pleasure at what happened in China, making cheerful comments about the impact of the crisis on China, such as the crisis would slow down China's economic growth and may hurt China's rise. And it may even cause social and political stability, and also would facilitate the decoupling of the two economies. Plus the fact that for a long time, the U.S. government didn't provide any substantive assistance to China in the first 2 months. So I and my colleagues as well feel so frustrated that this shows how deep the geopolitical and ideological differences between our two countries, and they basically override humanitarian concern. So to some extent, this was taken as a continuation of the strategic competition between our two countries. Strategic competition launched by the Trump administration starting from early 2017, and they just took this an opportunity to pursue this competition. And at the second stage, when the virus began to spread and escalate in the U.S., and now we begin to hear that people are blaming China for not responding to the virus in the initial stage quickly, and also for not being transparent enough, in spite of the fact that countries and regions around China, like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, they did pretty well in containing the spread of the virus. So this kind of bipartisan and scapegoating is still going on, and which, of course, very much poisoned the atmosphere of this relationship. So that's the negative impact of the crisis on U.S.-China relations. But at the same time, there is also some positive dimension, which is worth mentioning. During the first stage, I think that even though the U.S. government didn't make any substantive assistance, U.S. enterprises, NGOs, and broadly ordinary people, they provided a lot of support to China's fight against the virus. And also, more importantly, scientists and doctors on both sides, they started to cooperate from the very beginning, from early January, and this cooperation lasted until now. And also, recently, when the U.S. began to face more challenge from the coronavirus, Chinese government, the central government, and the local government, and as well as the enterprises, they are actually providing a lot of assistance and support to the U.S. side. So these positive developments really show the strong bond between two countries, and they are really the strong force for good in a world that transcends geopolitics and politics. So again, this crisis occurred in a very unfortunate time, and I think the two sides didn't have good cooperation in the initial stage, but gradually we began to realize that we had to cooperate and we could cooperate. So now we began to see the positive trend, and I hope this trend will continue. So I will stop here first.
Thank you. We'll come back to some of those points. Let me turn next to you, Evan, and get your sense of how we got here and what's happening.
Let me thank both Xinbo and Wang Jisoo for participating with us. I think this discussion is incredibly timely and it's incredibly important given how rapidly evolving both the crisis is globally and the U.S. China relationship. And I echo Wu Xinbo's points about this, the pandemic having very serious implications for the U.S. China relationship, both good and bad. So in that context, let me make three very brief points. First, talk about the global context. Second, talk about the U.S. China context. And then third, just end very briefly with a few modest suggestions for U.S. China cooperation going forward that we can develop hopefully later in the discussion. First is the global context. I think it's important in this conversation about U.S. China relations to remember that this is a global crisis, not a U.S. China crisis. And it's a unique global crisis. It's unprecedented because it's really three global crises at the same time. It's a macroeconomic crisis, it's a financial crisis, and it's a health crisis. But fundamentally, all three of these crises are going to be solved by science. And at the end of the day, it's the pace and the scope of the pandemic will determine how bad it gets. And I think that we're in a world where not until a vaccine is found, produced, and distributed, ultimately will this crisis be over. And the reason that I frame it in terms of a global crisis is because a global crisis requires a global response. In other words, institutions are going to matter. And to date, several months into this global crisis, what's clear to me is that the international response has been lacking substantially. If you look at the early days of 9/11, you look at the early days of the global financial crisis, there was far more global institutional response than we've seen to date. Now, granted, globally, there has been pretty good response on the financial side. Global central banks and global treasuries and finance ministries have actually acted very quickly in a coordinated way, and that's been good. But we still haven't seen any substantial response on the part of the IMF or the World Bank. And we haven't really seen the WHO do much in terms of helping to prepare for sort of the next stage of this. And so I think that I raise this simply to highlight the fact that there are a lot of issues that touch the U.S. China agenda that are global in nature. And it's pretty clear that if you're going to have a global institutional response and you want international institutions to step up to the plate, the U.S. and China have to be a big part of that conversation. A second point, the U.S. China context. I very much agree with Xinbo that this episode, the timing of it was highly unfortunate, and it's really going to just accelerate this movement towards strategic competition. But it's going to be a very substantial accelerant. I don't mean to downplay it. I'm quite concerned. This should have been a period of substantial cooperation between the United States, right? When I was in the White House, this is the ideal, the classic example of cooperation between the United States and China. As I and many others have said, if the US and China can't cooperate on a global pandemic, what can we cooperate on? And so, as Xinbo said, I think what we've seen in the last several months is some very unfortunate realities about the US-China relationship. And what we're seeing is that both sides have found themselves in a situation where both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are essentially looking to spread blame and distract from their respective failures, different types of failures, but nonetheless, both of them are using each other as a tool to spread blame and to distract from their failures. Let me focus a little bit on the U.S. side and U.S. policy toward China. I'm quite concerned about where the trend line is as Trump seeks to use China to spread blame and distract from the substantial failures at home. You're seeing very substantial changes in elite opinion in the United States. I think in the upcoming presidential election, you're going to see China be as much, if not more, of an issue as the 1992 election after Tiananmen. In fact, I think it's probably going to be worse. Right after Tiananmen, the Tiananmen massacre was repugnant to many Americans, but COVID is very different because now it's, China is just not doing something that America doesn't like. It's a China that looks very, very dangerous. It's undermining our health, it's undermining our economy, and ultimately our security. So I think we should brace ourselves for a period of very high politicization of China and the U.S. China relationship that probably will be worse than the 92 election right after Tiananmen. Number two, we're not just seeing changes in elite opinion, but also public opinion as well. And Mike Green referenced the Harris poll that the Washington Post wrote about last week, where there's largely bipartisan support for criticizing China. Number three, you're going to see U.S. policy remain very focused on constraining China. So even though the need for U.S.-China cooperation on the pandemic has gone forward, even though both sides are making efforts to implement the Phase 1 trade deal, the Trump administration has made a variety of decisions in the last week related to technology competition. So that's the FCC denying China or seeking to withdraw China Telecom's license. A year ago, it withdrew China Mobile's application, or it denied China Mobile's application for a license. The FCC said that Google could not run an undersea cable between the US and Hong Kong and had to go to Taiwan. So you're going to see a steady stream of executive branch administration policy actions, even as the US and China try and figure out where we can cooperate on the pandemic. And then fourthly, you simply have nationalism growing on both sides. You see a growth in Chinese nationalism, a Chinese pride in the efficient and effective response on the part of China, and heavy criticism of the United States. And I think you see similar nationalism on the part of the United States, this growing movement to blame China for lack of transparency and blame China for the virus. I think there's a lot of culpability to go around, but when you have instances where, for example, the Chinese military are criticizing the U.S. military for, how it's treating infected U.S. military officers, it just adds to this action-reaction cycle of nationalism in both sides. And so I think we need to be very aware of changes in elite opinion, public opinion, U.S. policy choices, which will continue, and then nationalism on both sides. Let me end with one final point, which is what would an agenda for U.S.-China cooperation look like? And at best, what we would want would be a coordinated solution, but I would accept parallel actions on the part of both Beijing and Washington. Number one, I think both sides need to take a deep breath and take cooperation out of high politics and push cooperation more toward the scientific and the medical communities. And the challenges before us are substantial. R&D on vaccine development, vaccine production, vaccine distribution, in addition to the institutional requirements of improving global surveillance and detection and testing. But nonetheless, when we get to a point where we actually have a vaccine, the challenge of industrial scale vaccine production and distribution is going to be a Herculean task. That will be a global challenge, and I think China needs to be a part of it. And so I would like to see more conversations between American scientists, the pharmacy community, the medical community, to think about that challenge. Because when we talk about producing and distributing vaccines in the developing world, Southeast Asia, Africa, etc., China's going to have to be part of that solution. Second issue, U.S.-China cooperation on institutional reform. It's very clear that institutions need to play a greater role, and they haven't to date. and I think the U.S. and China should start by getting the G20 together, agreeing on an agenda, and look to which institutions can carry out that particular agenda. And the third and final point is, I think both militaries need to be very careful and cautious to avoid actions that look opportunistic and provocative. Look, both sides are feeling very insecure these days, but nonetheless, I think we need to be mindful and careful to avoid accidents or miscalculations. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Evan. I think Professor Wang Jisoo is on the phone. We won't be able to see him. But Jisoo, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes,
so
I'm here.
Thank you. Sorry about the technical problems. We're on the first issue, which is how did U.S.-China relations come to this point since the COVID-19 crisis broke? And we, welcome your thoughts now. Welcome.
I think the China-U.S. relationship has been worsening since the outbreak of the crisis, despite some technical cooperation between the two sides. And I think I didn't hear Wu Xinbo, but I heard Evan Medeiros. I agree with him that there are a number of things we can do together technically. But I think we have to stop the blame game first. And I heard in the news this morning that Trump said on Wednesday his government is trying to determine whether the coronavirus emanated from a lab in Wuhan. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Beijing needs to come clean on what they know. I don't think that is a good sign. And some U.S. individuals and institutions are even trying to set lawsuits for China to compensate for the losses, and that alarmed the Chinese very much. And in substantive terms, it looks more difficult under the current circumstances, as Evan just said, for China and U.S. to implement the Phase 1 trade agreement signed between the two sides. And so this is an issue we have to talk about in some detail, that is how we continue to solve the trade issues. And unfortunately, the problems between the two sides parallel in nature, including those related to Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, human rights, and the South China Sea, see little hope of being improved. A more recent issue that causes a great deal of concern is America's effort to decouple its economic and technological engagement with China. And some U.S. officials and politicians are asking U.S. businesses to move out from China. Washington continues to sanction Huawei. The once promising educational and cultural exchanges are faced with many difficulties, partly due to pandemic and partly caused by the downward spiral of the relationship. So I don't think we should be very optimistic about the immediate future, and we should be alerted by the recent developments.
Thanks, Jisoo. Let me follow up with each of you. Xinbo said that he and many of his colleagues were disappointed, shocked at some of the name calling, the blame game, the criticism, some of the triumphalism or celebration by some American scholars or even officials that China was in trouble. I wanted to ask Xinbo and also Jisoo, do you think that scholars in China, that officials in China, or the Chinese public more broadly, did they think, or do you think that what you're describing was particular to the Trump administration? Or is there a belief in China that that the U.S. society and the American political system as a whole are now much more hostile to China? How much of this do you think is structural? How much of it is agency? How much of it is particular to the Trump administration itself? Or put another way, if Hillary Clinton were president right now, do you think we would be saying these same things? Is this a structural problem? from your perspective or your colleagues that reflects the overall American disposition or attitude, or is this particular to the administration we have right now? Why don't you start us off, Xinbo?
Well, my observation is that this has a lot to do with the current administration, which launched the strategic competition with China and also emphasized the geopolitical and ideological differences with China. If this was a Clinton administration, I think they would regard as a kind of common challenges confronted both countries and the rest of the world, which require collaboration in managing this kind of humanitarian crisis, and would put this as kind of issue on the agenda of global governance rather than as an issue on the agenda of China-US geopolitical competition or promoting the decoupling of two economies. So I think somehow this administration, they created a framework in which this issue is treated. And also they took the opportunity of this crisis to pursue their own agenda for either political fight with China, geopolitical struggle with China, as well as the decoupling of the two economies. That certainly have the spillover effect on the society in general. But as I just alluded to, actually we received very impressive support from the society, the business, the ordinary people, NGOs, in their assistance to China. So to some extent, if I have to blame somebody, I think it is mainly this administration with a particular mentality on China. So will different administration make a difference? The answer is certainly yes. So that's why I started by saying this crisis occurred in a very unfortunate time.
Jisoo, what's your interpretation? Is this particular to the Trump administration?
I didn't hear what Wu Jinbo says, but I will give you my opinion anyway. I think the general feeling in China is that the United States does not want to China to stand up as a global power. So it doesn't matter who is representing the United States, whether the general audience doesn't really have a good sense of a political struggle in the United States or the polarization between the Democrats and Republicans. I think the general feeling is that the Americans don't want to China to stand up, and that they have ill feelings about the Chinese. They have some racism against, prejudices against the Chinese population in the United States. So I think the general sentiment is not good. But more sophisticated analysts, of course, have a better understanding of what the United States is doing, and they even discern some differences of opinion within the administration itself between Trump and some of his aides, and they are watching very closely to the presidential election campaign at this moment.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, I think many of the sources of competition predate COVID-19, including the South China Sea. We see continued action by the PLA Navy and the Chinese Coast Guard, issues of intellectual property rights, and so on and so forth. But at a minimum, the COVID-19 challenge is making it impossible for us to manage those, and is making them worse, is accelerating some of the tensions. Let me turn to the second topic. We want to get to questions, and you can email them now if you're listening or watching us by sending your email to U.S China Dialogue, all one word, U.S China Dialogue at georgetown.edu, and I'll start turning to those questions in a moment. But I want to get to our second topic, which is what in the near term can we do? I'm going to start with you, Evan. I'm going to ask, if I could, and I did not tell our panelists I would do this, but I'm going to ask, Evan, what are 2 or 3 things, very specific things, if you could get into Zhongnanhai right now and talk directly to Xi Jinping or the CMC, what are 2 or 3 specific things that you would recommend he do, in China's interest, and not just about the virus, but on the virus and more broadly? What are 2 or 3 things he could do to maybe change the dynamic? And then I'll turn to Xinbo and Jisoo and say, if you can get into the White House to see President Trump, what are 2 or 3 things, specific things you would tell him to do to try to stabilize the situation and maybe get a better balance between competition and cooperation? But we'll start with you, Evan. What's your advice to Zhongnanhai right now?
Sure. So a couple pieces of advice, building off my comments earlier. Number 1 is set up a sort of senior scientists, senior doctors expert group to work together to collaborate on questions of developing a vaccine, producing a vaccine, distributing the vaccine, right? Have the 2 largest economies in the world be at the forefront of that particular effort, while of course bringing in the entire international scientific community. In other words, reframe the issue from U.S. China to one of solving a global issue, and then having the U.S. and China and other scientific powers, Japan, Korea, Germany, et cetera, sort of come in and share best practices. I think that's going to be essential. Number 2, I think we need to convene a G20 meeting as soon as possible in order to begin coordinating macroeconomic policy, so specifically monetary and fiscal policy, because I think the problems globally are only going to get worse, right? Earlier this week, the IMF released its World Economic Outlook, and it's really bad, right? I mean, we're looking at recession globally. The projection for Chinese growth in 2020 was 1.2, 1.3%, right? It's bad. And it's clear that we all sort of sink or swim together. And so I think it's important for the G20 to come together, to 2 largest economies, to be showing that they're coordinating, and then identify an agenda, and then begin tasking different international organizations, economic organizations, health organizations, development organizations, with implementing that particular agenda. In other words, showing how we're starting to re-empower international institutions. I also think that the U.S. and China need to take a really hard look at the WHO, right? I mean, I have my frustrations with, the role that the WHO had played. But I'd like to see the U.S. and China and a variety of other major economies take a hard look at the WHO. So experts group, institutional reform, let's agree on sort of rules of the roads of things that we're not going to do. So, we're going to ban the tough rhetoric. We're going to avoid provocative military actions. We're going to avoid unilateral economic actions that would destabilize the global economy. So, agreeing to that sort of list of actions both sides won't take, what I think would be particularly useful. Now, I'm inclined to say that both sides should agree to form a group to look at the origin of the Wuhan virus, but I sort of feel like that would just that would just take us back to the name and shame, the name calling, the rhetorical battle on both sides. So I think that should probably be off the table for now. So over to you, Mike.
All right, Xinbo, American foreign policy as well as anyone in the U.S. government. What would you recommend to President Trump if you could get into the White House tomorrow or the next day to give him advice?
Well, first and foremost, I will advise him to stop attacking China, scapegoating China for the coronavirus, especially in a time China is trying to provide support and assistance to U.S. fight against the virus. And China is showing its goodwill, and the U.S. should return the goodwill and stop punching China's face in Taiwan, South China Sea, Huawei, China Telecom, all these kind of issues. Otherwise, this kind of temporary improvement in this relationship will not be sustainable, and he should be able to constrain the China hawks in his team and making sure that this current positive trend will not be reversed. And the second recommendation is that gradually he should seek China's coordination and cooperation about how to recover U.S. economy and the world economy in general. I know this is very much on his mind for political reason. So if the U.S. is going to recover its economy, it's very difficult to do it without the help and coordination from other countries, particularly from China. So this will require broader coordination, as Evan already alluded to, among G20 and other main economies. The third recommendation would be in the forthcoming campaign, which will start from the summer very soon. Stop playing the China card and to exploit the political capital, either on the coronavirus issue or use this card as a leverage to attack Mr. Biden for his so-called connection with China, because this will somehow bring back this relationship back to the early negative state. So actually these recommendations are on my list, and but I very seriously doubt whether this can be taken seriously by Mr. Trump. Yeah, and over to you.
We take it seriously. Maybe that's a start. Jisha, if you could,
Yes?
if you could advise President Trump on how to minimize the tension and increase cooperation realistically, what would you recommend to the White House right now?
I think I would recommend three things. The first is I think the effectiveness of the China-U.S. cooperation on fighting the pandemic depends partly on some multilateral mechanism that should involve individuals and organizations in Europe, Japan, Russia, and other countries. But it is a pity that the Trump administration is ferociously attacking WHO. And therefore, it is hard for Americans to join anything that WHO is likely to coordinate. I think I agree with Mike and Evan in their point. I think you wrote something I read yesterday that you should engage global organizations such as the WHO. So I would like to recommend, forget about the shortcomings or anything political about WHO, but we need to play a role in a multilateral basis, on a multilateral basis. This is the first point. The second is that the two countries could join other members of the UN Security Council to pass a resolution demanding a ceasefire in Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, South Sudan, Yemen, and some other countries and regions to fight this deadly threat to human lives. I heard a few days ago some motions were being discussed in the UN, but wonder why there have been no follow-ups. Such an action, a joint resolution, could show to Americans and Chinese that they have a common interest in maintaining containing regional conflicts and join hands to enhance global peace. The prevention of North Korea from developing nuclear weapons and provocations should remain a priority in China-U.S. strategic coordination. So the two sides should cooperate with each other on the Korean issue. And a third suggestion I would make is about Taiwan. I think there is a potential flat point in Taiwan. Tsai Ing-wen will be inaugurated on May 20th as the Taiwanese leader. What kind of U.S. gesture shown to her inauguration will have some implications for China-U.S. relations? So I would suggest some kind of careful gesture to Taiwan. Of course, I know that some people will go there and congratulate her and observe the inauguration, but should be mindful of China's action. It is possible that the mainland will do some, for instance, military exercises or what you call saber rattling things in the Taiwan Strait around that time to form the pro-separatist movement. So the two sides should get together to notify each other what the two sides might do for their own political purposes. That's what I'm more going to suggest.
Thank you, Jisoo. I think the point you make about multilateralizing the cooperation is critical. And this is one of the arguments Evan and I made in our foreign affairs piece you referenced. There is some bright light in that the G20 put out a statement yesterday, I think it was yesterday, with some principles on debt and financial issues. And I personally think that this is not an environment where a bilateral U.S. China initiative will have the kind of impact it would have had, say, 10 or 20 years ago. But in a multilateral context, like the G20, you mentioned the UN and the WHO, but I think the G20 showed that kind of somewhat smaller forum can be useful. And then, of course, as Evan pointed out, the Federal Reserve Bank, People's Bank of China, quietly in ways we don't always see, thank God, the top financial people in both countries are quietly working together. We have a great set of questions, so I'm going to go to the questions, and we'll end with the third issue, the longer term prospects. But I got a couple of questions when I said I think conflict is unlikely because of this. One questioner, a journalist from Hong Kong, pointed out that many netizens in China are saying now is the time to seize Taiwan because the U.S. is distracted. And then someone else from Beijing said, is there a danger that Donald Trump, in his desperation to get reelected, may escalate pressure on China too much? So people don't accept my reassuring comment that conflict is very unlikely. So maybe the three of you can do a better job or not convincing them. Let me start with you, Evan. And if you'd like to respond to the earlier points, go ahead. But let's revisit this danger of conflict over Taiwan or other issues right now.
Yeah, so I don't think conflict over Taiwan is on the table right now, simply because, I mean, one of the unique aspects of this crisis is it's so fundamentally debilitating to the national capacities of both countries, right? Governments at the federal level, at the local level, economies. I mean, this is not, neither country has the ability or the inclination to start an armed conflict. But I do want to make one additional point about Taiwan, and I want to add that to my list of items that I would recommend to Xi Jinping. And that is, now is the time to show a little bit of flexibility and confidence on the question of Taiwan, simply because Taiwan has handled the pandemic so well. It identified the disease very, very early on. It enacted spread testing. It has scientists working on a vaccine. There are a lot of things that we can learn from Taiwan's experience. And so instead of seeing American efforts to work with Taiwan and Taiwan's efforts to work with other countries as, you know, a effort to, you know, for Taiwan to break out of, you know, or to expand its international space. So to avoid seeing everything Taiwan's doing as part of the, you know, geopolitical competition between America and China, but rather seeing it for what it is, which is a highly competent set of public health authorities that are sharing best practices with other countries. In other words, you know, the politics of Taiwan will always be there. Now is the time for all of us to learn from Taiwan. And I think, for example, I'd recommend that Xi Jinping re-allow Taiwan to join the annual World Health Assembly. I think that would be a fantastic gesture going forward. So I don't think realistically we're not going to see war over Taiwan, simply because neither has the time, inclination, or capacity to do so. But I think now could be a very interesting time to be a little bit more open-minded, given how well Taiwan has weathered this particular pandemic situation.
Let me ask.
May I say something? Yes.
Yes,
I
please.
think I like Evan's points, and I understand what he is talking about. But I would say that on the Chinese side, the feelings are somewhat different. I think I hear many voices in China from netizens and even some policy advisors that U.S. preoccupation in the election year and over the pandemic provides a good opportunity to solve the Taiwan issue by forceful means, once and for all. Whenever I give a speech, like this afternoon I gave a speech on U.S. China relations, I'm always asked the same question. That is, whether this is a good opportunity for us to solve the Taiwan issue, an armed liberation of Taiwan, is it feasible and desirable, and it should be on our timetable. And of course, I'm somewhat concerned about this. I hope Chinese and U.S. officials will have a serious dialogue to draw a red line to avoid military conflict over Taiwan. I think we have little information about what Taiwan is doing about the pandemics. Evan says something that I understand, but it is not that widely reported on the mainland about what is going on in Taiwan about the virus. So both sides should abide by. I mean, the Americans and the Chinese should talk to each other, and because we have some kind of tacit understanding we reached in the past. That is, you would never. The United States is discouraging Taiwan from declaring de jure independence, and on that condition, China will not use force. But it is not well known in China that there's such a tacit understanding. And some Chinese are even proposing that we should amend the anti-secession law to make room for us to move on to the military solution to the Taiwan issue. And of course, this is our concern. I don't want that to happen, but we should have to talk about this to assure both sides that that kind of thing is not going to happen.
You know, you know this, I'm sure, but sympathy for Taiwan in the United States, in the Congress and in the public and media, among think tanks and experts, is quite high compared to 15 years ago when Chen Shui-bian was in charge. In part because there's more confidence that Tsai Ing-wen is being careful about de jure or de facto independence than Chen Shui-bian was. And in part there's sympathy because of what happened in Hong Kong and because of the Taiwan authorities, you know, quite capable handling of the current crisis. On the other hand, you know, it's not just an implicit statement. I remember drafting and President Bush saying very explicit things. Jim Kelly, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice in testimony, and I'm sure it was the same for the Obama administration, that the U.S. opposes unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. That's fairly standard. So there's evidence there you can point to, but there is a higher sympathy for Taiwan. And I think a broader consensus that Taiwan is coming under unfair pressure in recent years. So it's not a static situation. It is moving, and this crisis makes the lack of dialogue and the lack of trust all the more problematic as a result. I agree with you all. I think conflict is very unlikely, but it is a more unsettling issue because we are both reading developments quite differently. And it's not just the administration. I think it's on a bipartisan.
Mike, there's also.
Can I jump in on this point?
Well, I'm going to get to Jinbo and then I'll get to you, okay, Evan? Yeah, thanks, yes. Jinbo.
Well, on Taiwan and then another matter. Well, my concern is that this year we are going to see some kind of crisis in the Taiwan Strait. One reason is that we have seen the escalation of the U.S. support for Taiwan under the Trump administration, and some of the actions they have taken have been unprecedented. And two, as we have witnessed in the last 1.5 years, actually starting from early this year, the leader in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, has become very provocative vis-a-vis the mainland, which was very different from her behavior in the previous several years when she was in power. So I think this kind of factors, the growing U.S. support for Taiwan, as well as more and more provocative stance by Taiwan towards the mainland, combined have somehow agitated a much stronger response from the mainland. So if you may Washington took some major step in extending further support for Taiwan in Taiwan, and then Tsai will take this as a very encouraging message for getting even more provocative towards Beijing. So you can see this kind of vicious cycle to continue down the road. And in this regard, I wouldn't rule out some kind of crisis occurred in the Taiwan Strait. Will that lead to major conflict? I hope not. But in today's world, there are many things that we cannot anticipate. They occurred as unexpected. And another issue I want to mention when we talk about conflicts in this relationship is that down the road, once the U.S. campaign started during the summer, as Evan already mentioned, I think Trump will play China card in an unprecedented way. So that will encourage Congress to pass many resolutions, sanctions against China. So that means the impact on this relationship is not just rhetorical or atmospherical, but there will be further substantive damage to this relationship. And that will cause the crisis in areas other than Taiwan in this relationship. And my concern is that under the current atmosphere, it's very difficult to amend once the momentum is moving in the negative direction. Yeah.
Thanks.
Mike, the point I was going to make was a very narrow, specific point, which is just simply, if we're going to have a crisis this year, you would need a PLA that's ready. And one area where the Chinese have been very non-transparent is how COVID has affected the PLA. I think officially, the Chinese government has said that no military officials, officers, non-commissioned officers have been affected by COVID. Hard to believe that. So, I mean, the question is, how can we have a crisis if the militaries on both sides are being affected by the health situation just as much as the general populations? But I think Wu Xinbo's broader point is an important one, which is Taiwan is it has entered a particularly sensitive period. And I think that the possibilities for misperception on Taiwan are particularly acute this year. And so I think policymakers need to be aware of that.
Previous U.S. governments, including the ones we worked for, Evan, and previous Chinese governments have been able to talk about Taiwan and add some context and reassurance. And we were able to do it on the U.S. side without violating the so-called six assurances. We never negotiated Taiwan's future with Beijing, but we were able to explain how we saw the situation, our red lines, our intentions. I suspect that is not happening right now. On a whole range of issues, particularly Taiwan, there's not a very constructive strategic dialogue between Beijing and Washington. One of the participants, Min Ye from Boston University, asked about that. She said, given everything we've discussed and the difficulties of government-to-government high-level strategic dialogue right now, is there a role for 1.5 track or second track dialogue to build in some of the cooperation, confidence building that we all think is necessary? Jisoo, do you want to go first on that one? Do you think there's a role for scholars?
On which one? I didn't hear you clearly.
On one of our audience members asked, is there, because we don't have a good strategic dialogue, we have a crisis of mutual confidence, is there a role for scholars, former officials, or others to create a high-level 1.5 track dialogue, or maybe second track dialogue over the coming months to help stabilize the situation?
I think the overall environment, I mean, the political ecology in both countries is not very good for this kind of dialogue. When we talk about track 2, and Mike, you know very well that on the Chinese side, there are not many people who are track 2 participants who can speak on behalf of the whole interest of China, and also very good connection with the government. And particularly at this moment when we cannot see each other face to face, I think the strategic dialogue or the track 2 mechanism we used before is just not very possible at this moment. What I can think of is some kind of collaboration between think tanks on some research programs. For one thing, what is the identity you see in Taiwan? One anxiety I often hear on the Chinese side is most Taiwanese don't see themselves as Chinese. They have lost their China identity. So what can we do? That is one thing we can discuss. And in the long run, we have to find a solution. Of course, we cannot accept Taiwan independence, but without the dual independence, what can we do together to avoid that kind of confrontation? And there are some other things we can do together. For instance, think tanks can work together on some research about businesses in both countries. To what extent decoupling is acceptable and is possible between the two sides, technological and economically. And what are the business people thinking about the bilateral relationship? We know quite well each other what we are thinking about in our bilateral relationship, but the business communities, what they are thinking about is a very crucial question in the long run.
I have a question, if I could, for Xinbo and Jishe, which comes from Paul Hare from the Center for National Interest and some others. What should we make of the widespread perception in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, and elsewhere that Beijing is engaging in a kind of propaganda effort to enhance its position, maybe at the expense of the United States? Do you think that's an overblown interpretation? There's a lot of focus, as you know, in the US and Europe and Japan on this sort of whatever you want to call it, charm offensive, soft power, propaganda war, information campaign. What should we make of this? Is this threatening? Is it something that you think is succeeding? Would you like to see it changed? Xinbo, do you mind going first?
Well, first of all, I think it's overblown in interpreting this as kind of well-planned and well-coordinated internally propaganda campaign by the Chinese government. I think the coverage on China's assistance to other countries hit by the coronavirus is intended to somehow amend the Chinese image that was somewhat smeared by the early crisis in China. So now China overcome the crisis. Now we are trying to help others and providing assistance to them. So that is one reason. Another reason is that I think, of course, this also has to do with President Xi's idea about the shared destiny of humankind. So if you really believe in this kind of vision, this is a classic example when the humankind is confronted with this kind of crisis, countries should help each other, and China is doing its best in this regard. Will this come at the expense of the U.S.? I don't think so. I mean, this kind of leadership role, or from the Chinese perspective, we think that shows China behave as a responsible major power. So we don't really believe this is a time to grab leadership from the U.S. And at the end of the day, leadership is not self-claimed or monopolized. It has to be earned through your hard work, your credibility, and your reputation. So I think, in a time, when the world is hit by this kind of humanitarian crisis, we should not let geopolitical concern become the priority concern. So I think it's just, overread in interpreting the Chinese attitudes in this regard. Yeah.
Jisoo, do you have a comment?
Talking about geopolitical competition, I think one thing we often talk about in China today is the strengthening of China, Japan, South Korea free trade zone, or some kind of economic integration or political cooperation. Of course, the United States is concerned about this. I guess it's very natural, but I think the one gesture we should have from the United States is that you should encourage the three-way dialogue because you can gain much from this. And I think it is also, if we are talking about the geostrategic competition, I think the competition go well beyond Asia. China surely is a nation power, but China's ambition is to become a global power, and these influences are already global. And as Mike and Evan may have noticed, I proposed many years ago that China should march toward the western part of the Eurasian continent for natural resources, markets, and political influence. I often complain about the policy making apparatus in Washington toward China that is way too Asia-oriented. And now we hear every day, every evening, I watch the news, and President Xi Jinping makes phone calls to foreign leaders literally on a daily basis. And what's this Trump doing? Diplomatically, I don't know very much about this. So, including the phone calls between Xi Jinping and with leaders from Finland, Serbia, and Brazil, South Africa, and China would not be content. That is, I'm thinking about this. China should not be content with being the leader in Asia only, but is boasting of taking global leadership, like in this fighting the pandemic. So, and China's flagship project is the Belt and Road Initiative that is global. And President Xi, just Wu Xinbo mentioned this, is calling for building up a community of shared future for mankind. So what is the response from the United States to this proposal? I'm wondering.
Kevin, do you want to respond to that? I'm, it may be too vague for people to know how to respond, but do you think there's something being proffered by Beijing that the U.S. could pick up on, particularly this common humanity or
not really. I think that past history has shown that the community of common destiny is not a concept that's likely to serve as an enduring foundation for U.S.-China cooperation. I think we're far past that at this point. But I do think that given the nature of the question, I do think that Xi Jinping should tamp down the propaganda apparatus a little bit. It's being interpreted on the part of the United States as being largely directed at criticizing the United States and trying to deflect blame for challenges at home. And I don't say that as somebody that believes that the United States hasn't made a number of mistakes on its own part. I mean, Trump's decision to defund the WHO, I just think completely lacks strategy and is inconsistent with solving this problem at a global level. But if I was going to talk to Xi Jinping, I would ask him to take the propaganda down several notches. Regardless if Americans are misinterpreting it or not, that's just, I think it's complicating our ability to work together at a time where it's essential to solve the economic, the financial, and the health crisis.
A number of the questioners have asked specifically about lessons learned in U.S. China relations. One asked whether the U.S. should respond to China's request that information be provided on the U.S. Army athletic team's visit to Wuhan. Others are asking, what does it mean that Donald Trump says he's going to investigate and find out what happened in Wuhan? It sounds to me, from what you're saying, like, and in fact, Evan, you said this, and others, that a sort of a binational who's to investigation will be completely unproductive, and unilateral efforts by each side to blame the others aren't going to be particularly helpful either. But Steve Orlins asks, and also a student from Carnegie Mellon asks, is there a way to learn from this crisis on the consequences of not finding patterns of cooperation? Could there be a kind of re-examination by scholars or governments in the future about lost opportunities for cooperation? You know, the Trump administration pulled people out of Beijing from the Center for Disease Control. The Chinese government was very slow to let the WHO in. This is not an investigation of who created the virus, but rather, did we miss opportunities to cooperate? Do you think there's room, and maybe this would be what a second track or scholarly effort would be, do you think there's room to learn, as Steve Orlin says, make this a teachable moment about the consequences of not having mechanisms for cooperation, even in the midst of, you know, competition in other areas? What do you think, Xinbo?
Well, I'm thinking about the previous two crises. One was September 11th, the other is 2008. Actually, in both crises, China and the US had very good cooperation, quite prompt cooperation. Actually, after September 11th, China extended support and cooperating with the United States. During the 2008 financial crisis, China also moved very quickly to cooperate with US and other major economies in dealing with the crisis. Why this time the cooperation was so slow to come, and what was the problem? So, as from a purely academic perspective, I think it certainly begs some serious research which can really tell, how either structural factors or some independent variables they played in and affect the cooperation. Because this is already the third major crisis confronting us in 21st century, and this is not going to be the last one. So for the future major crisis, if China and US, the two major economies, the two major countries in the world, cannot cooperate and coordinate well, it will be very difficult for us to meet the challenge. So we're not sitting down to blame each other, to find a fault with each other, but rather, we are really trying to find a way that we learned lesson from the past, so that in the future we can do better. So, Mike, if you and Evan are going to launch a project at Georgetown, Fudan University would be happy to be a partner to that. Okay.
That's thumbs up from Evan. It's a great suggestion from in Steve Orlin's question. I think Jenny Ju is your student at Fudan, and our student George Bradshaw both asked, what does this mean for the future of the global order, and in particular our ability to cooperate on big challenges like climate change. This pandemic will pass. There will be, I think most people would agree, eventually there will be a vaccine, there will be ways to control it. But climate change is a more structural and enormous challenge. And if we can't deal with this one, how would we deal with climate change? our two students ask, and that might be the angle from which you examine this. What are the lessons for how we cooperate on other transnational challenges? Evan, what do you think? Is there? You just put your thumb up. So you think this is a right area for positive research?
I think there is a very active agenda here for track 1.5, track 2 to look at lessons learned. The key is going to be to make sure that you have people at the table that really understand the chronology and the sequence of government actions on both sides, so you can come up with constructive solutions and it doesn't just descend into blaming both sides. I do think this question of the origins of the virus is going to be important to manage. And what I mean by that is I think we should try and take that question of the origins, patient zero, out of the U.S. China context, and we're going to have to put it into a WHO context, right? Just have the experts look at it. And that might create some very uncomfortable truths for China. And I think that's going to be a big challenge for the Chinese government to manage, because in fact, if it does turn out that the Chinese know who patient zero is, and it didn't come from a wet market, that could be, very, very controversial. But let's take it out of the U.S. China context. Let's put it in a WHO context. Let's have have the group of scientific experts, virologists, epidemiologists from all over the world do something like that. But clearly, the way this has been handled, both at a government-to-government level as well as a subnational level, requires further review. Let me just end by saying, Mike, I think that looking forward, there's sort of three big factors that we should all be watching in the next several months. Number one, how much damage to the U.S.-China relationship is done during the election. I think that's going to be important, and I think Xinbo and I very much agree that China is clearly going to be a centerpiece of this presidential election, unlike any other dating back to '92. And the question is how resilient is the relationship, right? Even though there will be a steady stream of Americans saying just ignore the election rhetoric, policy is policy. I don't think we're in a world anymore where election rhetoric doesn't create lasting damage. Number two, I think that the next several months will really be a test for subnational actors and bottom-up forces on both sides, right? I mean, because a lot of the cooperation we've seen has been more at the subnational level than at the government-to-government level. And I think this is a real test for the relationship to see whether or not those ties are substantial enough, given the fact that the national ties, government to government, are not very good. And that will give us a sense of how great a source of balance subnational actors are. And then lastly, to pick up Jisu's point, this is going to be a real test for the business community. The pressures on decoupling and diversifying supply chains are going to be substantial. And I think we're really going to see the business community on both sides tested in very significant ways. And it could result in a very significant unwinding of economic interdependence, both for health reasons, national security reasons, and economic reasons. And I think we need to be alert to that, because that could put the relationship on a very different trajectory if economic interdependence is no longer serving as the ballast that it once was. Full stop there. Mike, you're on mute.
We're at the end of our time, so let me ask Xinbo and Jisu to each give us 1 or 2 minutes on what you will be watching, what you expect to happen over the coming years as we deal with this pandemic and more complicated U.S.-China relations. So Xinbo, and then we'll finish with Wang Jisu.
Well, I think we already talked about the U.S.-China relations for the remaining time of this year, and certainly my concern is that it may go even lower. But beyond this year, it depends on who will be the next U.S. president. So I think this relationship is always placed out in the internal political dynamics in two countries. So even though some of the structural issues they remain there, but with the change in political leaders, there will be adjustment in their political agenda and also the different policy options. So sometimes I'm not too pessimistic about this relationship, because I think somehow in both countries you have different forces that drive this relationship, and sometimes they play a role to make sure this relationship will be overthrown fundamentally. So, but the most important thing for me, speaking as a scholar, is that we can continue this candid and constructive dialogue in a time when the official relations are difficult. Scholars can still have the candid and constructive dialogue, and we remain to be a force for better and stronger ties between our two countries. Thank you again for organizing this event, and stay in touch. Stay healthy.
Thank you. Yes, you too. Thank you. Finally, why don't you say?
Yes, my final words. I think, recently I heard some Chinese people telling me that there is a generation gap in our perceptions about the United States. The younger generation tends to be more patriotic, proud of China's achievements, and you older guys don't know very much about the future. So my response is that we understand what you are talking about, but we experienced the old days when China and the United States was confronting with each other, and then both sides suffered. So yes, I understand the patriotism, pride of China, but I should emphasize the importance of the bilateral relationship. We cannot afford to have any kind of confrontation between the two sides, because the younger generation will suffer from that. So that is my sentiment.
Those are wise words. I appreciate that, Jisa. And my own sense is that this is a teachable moment, as Steve Orland suggested in his comment, about the importance of cooperation, but it's also illuminated for us that we truly are in a new structure in U.S. China relations. This is now an era of strategic competition, and I think the challenge we'll have is to think of ways to manage the competition and to build patterns of cooperation where it's in our interests. This is no longer going to be a case where we seize opportunities for a G2 or a new model of great power relations. I think those days are behind us for a while. Now we have to think about how do we build much stronger patterns of cooperation, trust, strategic dialogue in a context that is now in both countries. And I think in the US, in my view, on a bilateral basis, that is now largely driven by competition for the foreseeable future. The election will be critical. You know, in the Carter election, Reagan promised to re-normalize relations with Taiwan, and a few years later had one of the best relations with China ever. Bill Clinton said he wouldn't coddle the butchers of Beijing after Tiananmen, and then he brought China into the final stage of the WTO. And my boss, George W. Bush, said during the election, China's a strategic competitor, not a strategic partner, and he and Hu Jintao had a pretty productive relationship. So the elections are cyclical in a way. The China theme can rise and fall depending on circumstances, but we are not in a purely cyclical period in the relationship. It structurally is different. So the challenge for us is to think about how to manage that. And I think the idea of a scholarly research project, and perhaps U.S. China dialogue can do it with Fudan and Beida, on lessons learned, not on who started this virus, but what were the lost opportunities where we would have both benefited from better mechanisms of cooperation. That's a great next topic for a research project for us, Evan, or for a dialogue like this. Thank you all for joining us. Apologies for the occasional technical glitch, but it was a rich discussion. We're better for it. And thank you all very, very much.